And so welcome everybody. My name is Michelle Mannion and I'm the Executive Director of the PCD Foundation. And also on this call, we have several board members from the PCD Foundation and Lynn Ernie, who I think most of you know. She's kind of the glue that holds the patient group together here. This is the third in a series that we have been doing to help patients with PCD get ready for clinical research. We have a sudden kind of explosion in interest from pharma for looking at therapies for people with PCD, something that we've been trying to prepare for 2 decades now, and it's happening. So we want patients to feel comfortable that they understand what all is involved in the research process. And we are delighted today to have Kelli Sullivan, Clinical Research Coordinator at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the person who keeps everybody in line throughout the Gdmcc and is our go-to person when we have questions about some of the regulatory and other issues that come up with research. And Kelli is going to talk about what it's like if you're a patient who decides to participate in clinical research, what actually that feels like. So I think without further ado, we will just go ahead and get going on with the discussion. Kelli?
Great. Okay, so tell me this first. You guys have my pretty full screen with no extra stuff in picture?
Yes.
Awesome, fantastic. Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Michelle, and thanks to Michelle and Lynn and the whole PCD Foundation for having me today. So my name is Kelli Sullivan. I'm a research coordinator at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. My job is to serve as the lead research coordinator for the Genetic Disorders of Mucociliary Clearance Consortium, or the Gdmcc. And today we're going to be talking about deciding to participate in clinical research, what comes next. So to set the stage, a few things. So clinical research, why do we do this? So clinical research is how we learn to diagnose, treat, and prevent illness. It's needed to understand and characterize the specifics of certain diseases and conditions. And we also use this to test potential treatment. So does the treatment work in people? Is a new treatment safe? Is this treatment better than the standard treatment for the disease, if there is a standard treatment for the disease? So that kind of sets our stage. And then I just want to kind of touch on the Gdmcc as a whole. The Gdmcc is made up of 8 sites. They're listed here. Apologies, Michelle and Lynn. I know the PCD Foundation Centers piece of this is out of date, but this is correct for our Gdmcc centers. The Gdmcc for many years was led by Mike Knowles and McGee Lee at UNC, and then in recent years, Stephanie Davis at UNC and Tom Ferkel have taken over as co-principal investigators for the consortium. So my job in the consortium is to work with our investigators and interface with all of our research coordinators at our various sites to move our research along. So what has the Gdmcc accomplished? So between 2006 and 2018, almost 1,300 participants were enrolled for research studies. This map shows enrollment by site. And as you can see, we've recruited subjects from all 50 states, many Canadian provinces, and even several other countries, as you can see. The Gdmcc has done a lot of research to clear the way for PCD clinical trials, though there's much more to be done. And then I just want to hit on a few, 3 very important things that the Gdmcc has done. And I want to hit on these basically just because there's some references later in the presentation, and I just want to make sure we're on the same page on things. The Gdmcc has had, like I said, probably 3 major accomplishments that have helped move PCD research along. The first is during the research study visits, we asked participants a few extra and more specific questions about clinical features to really hammer down what the PCD phenotype in children looks like. And you can kind of see here the 4 questions that we're focused on and lots of yes, no's that went along with that. The second thing that we did was the Gdmcc defined cutoffs for nasal nitric oxide so that it could be used as a diagnostic tool. So this was done by comparing nasal nitric oxide levels in patients that have PCD, those are the red triangles here, compared with folks who are healthy controls, and those are the blue circles here. And then the third big thing, the Gdmcc has also been involved in defining the genes associated with PCD. This slide shows 51 genes and the relationships of ciliary ultrastructure. The Gdmcc has been involved in in the careful characterization of about 60% of these genes. These known genes make up about 2/3 of known PCD cases. Okay, so that all kind of sets the stage. So our focus for today is really to discuss what happens when you're invited to participate in clinical research. To do that, there's kind of 4 main segments I'll be going through. The first is the types of studies there are. Second is study design and approval process. Third is informed consent. And then the fourth is study requirements and study visits. So to start off, we'll go through observational and interventional studies. So I think Michelle touched on this in the last talk. I really like the term that she used. Observational studies is getting to know you. So observational studies, we're not changing anything. We're just kind of observing what's happening with patients. So there's a few different types of observational studies. So you remember the study where the Gdmcc asked these questions to better understand the clinical phenotype of PCD in children? Well, that was a cross-sectional study. So that means that we collected data at only one point in time, and we used those data points to draw conclusions. Another type of observational study is a longitudinal study. So this means that the same data is collected multiple times, so at all different time points. So this here is an example of longitudinal data from the Gdmcc. And what we did here is we looked at the change in FEV1% predicted, which is the y-axis here, and that's over time. So if you look, every little line here is a specific person. So like this one up here, they came and when they were about 14 years old and their FEV1 was this number. And then when they were 15, it was this number, and so on and so forth. And we use this to draw conclusions and based on the different ultrastructural defects. And then a third kind of observational study is a case control study. So remember the nasal nitric oxide study? So that's an example of a case control study because we compared a case, so that's PCD patients in this example, to healthy controls, the controls in this case. And then before I move on regarding observational studies, another really good example of an observational study is the PCD registry that's just launching now. So that's an observational study, and as time goes on, it's a longitudinal study. So pretty cool. So let's move on to interventional studies. So this is where we change something to see if we can see an effect on a disease or condition. So maybe we're trying to study a medication to see if it improves lung function or the FEV1% predicted. So interventional studies are highly regulated. So I'm going to hit on a few kinds of terms and define them for you. So they are usually placebo-controlled. So what that means is that if you decide to sign up for a study that has a medication, some people in the study will receive the study medication, and then other people in the study will receive something that looks just like the study medication, but that doesn't have any active ingredients, and that's called placebo, okay? And then randomized. So what randomized means is that it's essentially a flip of the coin whether a subject in the study would receive the active medication or the placebo. And then double blind. So double blind means that the person who's enrolled in the study subject, does not know whether they're receiving the active medication or the placebo. And it also means that the research team doesn't know whether you're receiving the active medication or the placebo. And that's so we can make sure that we're assessing without bias, and so that we're making our results as strong and accurate as possible. So I think those things kind of get thrown around, so hopefully that gives a little definition there. An interventional study is going to require at least 2 study visits, usually more than that. But you're going to need 2 study visits. So you'll need 1 visit before, in this example, you start taking a medicine so that we can get your baseline FEV1 predicted value. And then a second visit would be required after you're taking the medication for a fixed amount of time. So let's say 28 days. And what we do is we repeat your PFTs, and then we try to see how your FEV1 changed over that time. And then on the analysis side, we're going to compare the groups taking the medicine to taking the active medication to the group that was taking the placebo to see if there's a difference in the results. Okay. And then, like I mentioned, interventional studies are highly regulated. And there's all different phases that we go through. So just to hit on that quickly, a phase 1 study is, the goal of that is to make sure that the treatment is safe in humans. These are really tiny studies. They take place in a very small group of folks, maybe 10 to 80 subjects, and it's usually done in only healthy controls, okay? Then a phase 2 study is where we determine the correct dosage and effectiveness in treating patients with the disease or condition. So this is really maybe the first time that patients who actually have PCD would be trying a medication. These studies are usually around 100 to 300 subjects. If all goes well, we move on to phase 3. That's a larger group of subjects. That's focused on determining if the treatment's safe and effective for a wide variety of people. So that can be 1,000 or more people could be needed for a study like that. Now, one note is that the FDA is monitoring this throughout all of the phases of the study. But if you finish your phase 3 trial, that's when you can do a submission for formal approval of the medication. And if it gets approved, then that's when your doctor could actually start prescribing the medicine to you, and you could start taking it. And then after that happens, there's phase 4, and that's post-marketing surveillance. That's to kind of check long-term effects, how folks are doing on the study, are doing on the medication. And that can be thousands of subjects. So obviously, these are challenging recruitment goals for rare diseases like PCD. This is why we really want to talk about what it's like to participate in PCD research. And so that we can hope to encourage everyone that's able to participate in the studies to participate. So now I move on to study design and approval process. Are there any questions I should try to answer before moving on? Okay, cool. All right, so study design and approval process. All right, so what do researchers do before starting a study? So first, we have to obtain funding from sponsors. There's a lot of different kinds of funding. There can be investigator initiated or federally funded studies. So all of the Gdmcc studies are federally funded. There's also industry sponsors. An example of that is the Perion Clean PCD study that we had several years ago. And then there can even be foundation funded studies. So an example of that would be our PCD registry that's just getting started. So once funding is obtained, we're gonna write a protocol that describes the research questions and descriptions of the tests that will be needed to answer the questions. In that protocol, we're gonna include background. So what do we know already? And what gaps are there that can be filled by the study? There's an inclusion and exclusion criteria. So who can participate in the study? There's rules about age, PCD symptoms, specific genetic mutations, all kinds of things. We'll get into eligibility criteria a little bit later. There's also a schedule of events. That's going to be the number and the timing of the study visits. So how long do we have between our study visits, and how long do those visits last? And then what kinds of tests are we going to be doing at our visits? So in the example I mentioned, we're probably going to be doing PFTs to check our FEV1 value. The research team also writes standard operating procedures so that all of the sites that are participating in a study know exactly how to do all of the procedures. We also write a safety and monitoring plan. And there are plans for data entry, data analysis, and sharing all of the information that's collected. So initial approvals and continuing review over the course of the study. So there's a lot of these. So there's a scientific review. There's going to be a safety and monitoring board that's reviewing at the start of the study and all throughout ongoing reviews. There's also a patient group review. So stakeholder advisory group. So for one of our current Gdmcc studies, we have a patient stakeholder advisory group. They were critical in helping us really work out some of the procedures when we were writing the protocol. And they really helped us with creating patient-facing materials so that the instructions and everything would be really clear for subjects who are participating in that study. On the really regulatory side, if it's a medication study, there's going to be an investigational new drug application that's submitted to the FDA. On the university or on the site side, there's tons of things we have to do, like institutional contracts, budgets, confidentiality agreements, material transfer agreements, data use agreements. And then there's the Institutional Review Board, and that's also called the Regulatory Ethics Board in Canada. I have a whole slide for the Institutional Review Board. Okay, so incredibly critical to human subjects research. The IRB reviews all studies that involve human subjects, okay? There's different kinds of IRBs. So there's institutional, so like a UNC IRB. There's commercial IRBs. And then there's also options for like central and single IRBs. So like one IRB might be overseeing other sites, but to say that any like local IRB, so if you do a study at UNC or say you do a study in St. Louis, even if there's a central IRB, the local IRB at the site still has oversight onto the site. So like if there was any issues that you needed to contact the IRB about, there is that option. And then the IRB assures that appropriate steps are taken to protect the rights and the welfare of people participating as subjects in research studies. To do that, studies are reviewed and approved before anyone can sign up for the study. They're reviewed and reapproved every year that the study is active. They review and approve any changes that are made to a study after the start. They approve documents that are associated with the study. So the informed consent form, study information and instructions. And there's also subcommittees for certain procedures. So like if there's a chest CT in a research study, we have our radiation safety committee reviews that. So there's a lot of rules and regulations that study teams follow, as a part of doing clinical research. And I wanted to just share a real patient-facing material example. So this is for one of our current Gdmcc studies. So the research team worked on developing this, and then we worked with our patient advocate or our stakeholder advisory group to really refine this. And they gave us comments to make sure it was clear and concise and that subjects participating in the study would like it. And then once we finalized it, we had to submit this to the IRB. The IRB had to review it and approve it. And now I'm allowed to share it with subjects that participate in the study. And I can show it here. So that is really the once we get through all of the approvals, there's also a whole startup and activation phase, okay? So once you have a study, you have to identify and train our study team. So that's gonna be physicians. There's study team doctors that are associated with the study, and they may or may not be your regular pulmonologist. It depends on the study. There's also research nurses / research coordinators. I'll call them research coordinators for the majority of this talk. That is going to be a subject's main point of contact and what I like to call your tour guide through the study. They're your contact for everything, and they'll help you through all the details. Other folks involved on the research team are going to be our regulatory team, statisticians and data managers, and support staff, which varies depending on the project. We also have to delegate the responsibilities, so who's going to be doing which parts of the study. We have to then set everything up at the site, so all the logistical pieces. Once that's done, we get approval and activation by our study sponsor, and then we're ready to start recruiting participants. So as you guys can see, there's a lot of work that really goes into that the study teams really have to do before we can ever get to enrolling a participant into a research study. Okay, so study recruitment. I am just going to say this is usually done by your research coordinator. There's a lot of different ways that we can recruit folks for research studies. All of these ways have to be approved by the IRB. So some examples of these could be, we could be allowed to approach folks that are coming to clinic for a regular doctor's visit. We can do telephone or emails. We can send letters. We can send out listservs. Subjects can also contact the research team. There's recruitment websites like clinicaltrials.gov that can really help you kind of know what studies are going on. And then there's contact information if you're interested on those sites. There's also patient forums and groups that you could see opportunities for research on. And then you could even see flyers in clinic. And then once you're getting recruited for a study, information about the study, so all of the details of the procedures, time commitment, reimbursement, that's all going to be discussed with you, and all of your questions would be answered. Okay, so once you have decided, how do you make it official? So this is informed consent in research. I'll just pause and see if there were any questions about the last section before I dig into this, though. Okay, cool. All right, so making official informed consent in research. Okay, informed consent in research. The purpose of informed consent is for subjects to understand their roles as subjects of research and to explain the purpose of research to a potential subject, including what their role would be and how the study works. There are two parts to informed consent. There's the informed consent document, and then there's informed consent discussions. Okay, why do we do informed consent? So there are two documents that point to informed consent. The first is the Belmont report. This describes basic ethical principles that should underlie the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects. There's three kind of constructs to that: respect for person, beneficence, and justice. And then there's the Nuremberg Code. And this is a 10-point statement defining permissible medical experiments. And one of the 10 main points, actually it's the first of the 10 main points, is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. I won't dig too much deeper into these. I did put links in here if folks are interested in learning more. Informed consent document. So there are a lot of requirements for the document itself, okay? It has to be understandable to someone who's educated at an 8th grade level. It has to be written in a language that the research subject understands. It does not include any language where subjects waive or appear to waive legal rights. And it does not include any language that releases any study team from liability or negligence. what else is included in the informed consent? So there are a bunch of required elements. I will read through these quickly. There's a statement that the study involves research and an explanation of what that research is. There's a description of risks and discomforts. There's a description of the benefits for participating in research. There's a description of the alternatives to participating in research. There's a statement about confidentiality maintenance, a statement about treatment and compensation for injury. It has your study contact team contact information. It talks about voluntary participation and withdrawal information. And there's a statement about personal health information or identifiable biospecimens. And then there's like a what else is included if applicable. So not all of these are going to be in every single consent form. It just depends on what the study is, what's in there. So things that could be included there are things like the approximate number of subjects that are going to be in the study. The fact that sometimes the fact that research involves risks that are unforeseeable, and a statement about clinicaltrials.gov. And then any of these other things could also be included if they're applicable. Okay, and then there's also Hipaa documentation in research. So Hipaa is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. That's from 1996. It's a federal law that required the creation of national standards to protect sensitive patient health information from being disclosed without a patient's knowledge. And then I put a little link here again if folks are interested in learning more. But what does Hipaa mean for a research study? So when you sign up for a study, there's a form that research participants need to sign that authorizes access to protected health information for research purposes. And I will just say this depends on the institution. Sometimes this is actually embedded in your consent form, or sometimes it's a separate document. It just depends where you're signing up for the study, what the rules are there. So that covers what the informed consent document is. So what about the informed consent discussion? So this is incredibly critical. So when we're talking about doing research studies and we're going through our informed consent, there's really 6 questions that the research team needs to be considering. It's who part 2, what, when, where, and why. So what does that all mean? So who on the research subject side is who's allowed to provide consent to participate. So first, it could be someone with the legal and mental capacity to give consent. So that's going to be an adult. It could also be a legally authorized representative. In terms of PCD, we usually think about this as the parent or legal guardian of a minor child that has PCD. And then actually, depending on the age of that minor child, there's age-specific assent forms that the child might be required to sign as well. And age requirements on who has to sign assents when, it varies based on the institution. They're always written at an appropriate reading level. And just kind of a note here, parental permission and assent would be needed for study participation if assent is required. Who, part 2, so who can obtain consent? So this is on the study team side. So our principal investigator must delegate responsibility. Most of the time, it's going to be your study coordinator who does your consenting with you. Whoever is doing the consenting has to have received appropriate protocol training. They have to have knowledge about how to actually consent someone in general. And they must speak the language of the subject, or they must have access to a reliable interpreter for the consenting. Okay. So what is signed? So that's the form. Subjects must be provided with the current IRB approved consent. So coordinators must check and document the consent version, because as time goes on in the course of a study, things change and we do have different versions. So we have to make sure we're using the most up-to-date version. And that up-to-date version includes all of the most up-to-date procedures. The research subject and the members of the team both sign the consent form. the subject receives a signed copy of the informed consent form. And depending on the study, a copy of the signed consent form might be placed in the medical record. So for example, if we're doing an interventional study where we're giving like a medication, we need to scan that into the electronic health record. And we do that so, if something were to happen, it is known that someone is participating in the study, just for the safety piece. When? So informed consent must be signed prior to conducting any procedures that are required as part of the study. So you can't do any study procedures until you're signed up for the study. We also have to have this form signed before we gather data about a participant and before we're marking any data in our study databases or in our electronic health records. Where? So if you're doing your consent form in person, this is going to be in a private room with your research coordinator or whoever is obtaining your consent form. In recent years, we've actually gotten the ability to do some remote consenting. So if we're doing remote consenting, that's going to be your coordinator is going to be reviewing the study with you on the phone or maybe using like teleconference software like Zoom, depending on what that institution allows. And then for signing the form, if it's remote, depending on the study and the rules, we can sometimes use an electronic consent form, or other times we might have to mail a consent or email a consent and print it out and mail it back, things like that. This depends on the study on how we make sure we get our signatures. Before signing, the subjects must have the opportunity to have time to read the entire document. And sometimes there are a lot of pages to consent forms. You have to have time to consider whether or not you want to participate. You have to have the opportunity to ask any and all questions throughout the consent review. And all of the questions must be answered prior to signing consent. And the coordinator actually has a responsibility to document what questions were asked, how they were answered. So, why? So again, remember this, the purpose of informed consent in research is for subjects to understand their role as subjects of research and to explain the purpose of research to the potential subject, including what their role would be and how the study works. So I think one thing I just want to point out here is when you're signing up for a study, questions are expected and they are encouraged. The study team wants you to understand the study and feel confident in your choice to actually participate in the study. I love answering questions, and I'm way happier if I get 20 questions than when I get 2 questions when I'm going through consent. So just keep that in mind when you're signing up for studies. Okay, and then informed consent is a process. So once you sign your informed consent document, that doesn't mean informed consent is over. So throughout the study, at every study visit, your research coordinator should be reviewing all of the study procedures and all the parts of the study. You should still be given ample opportunities to ask questions about the study. I think sometimes, maybe you've signed up for a study and then you think of a question, later that night or the next day. You're still allowed and you should ask that question. And your coordinator should be checking in with you as you're going through the study. The other thing the coordinator should do at every visit is that they need to verify that you do still want to participate in the study. And then to that end, participating in research is always voluntary. This is critical to remember. So you don't ever have to take part in clinical research. And then even if you sign up for a study, you can choose to stop at any time if it just doesn't make sense for you or you don't feel good about what's going on. It's totally okay. Also, the study investigator can choose to stop your participation in the study. And then just choosing not to participate in a study, whether that's before you sign consent or just declining participation, that doesn't affect your relationship with your doctor or your care team at all. And a research team will not be upset with you if you choose not to participate. So, From there, that's the end of the informed consent piece. Does anyone have any questions?
Kelly, Michelle asked about the meaning of beneficence when you were going, can you, well,
Yeah.
it was part of the Belmont report
Yeah.
back a ways, but I think that's a key thing to discuss here because if you think about beneficence in religious terms, it's selfless love is what that means. But for research ethics sort of thing, beneficence is really that the researchers should have the welfare of the participant as the goal of any clinical trial or any study, and that they're going to focus on optimizing to maximize the benefits of the study while minimizing any risks. So that's a principle that should be in all research. And I don't know if you want to expand on that anymore, but I think that's a key thing for people who are participating in research, is knowing that that is one of the key principles that anybody designing a study has to address. Anybody reviewing the study has to address that we've done everything we can to maximize benefit and minimize risk.
Yes, that is a fantastic summary. It's that people are treated in an ethical manner, not only by respecting decisions and protecting them from harm, but also making efforts to secure their well-being. And so, like you said, there's kind of two pieces to that. One is do not harm, and two is maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harm. So that's a great question and something to, yes, it's critical to focus on. Any other questions? Okay, cool. All right, so last piece, study requirements and study visits. Okay, so you've signed consent, now what? So depending on the study, you may sign consent and do part of the study or even the full study visit on the same day. And then if you sign up remotely, your study visit will probably be scheduled for a day soon after your consent signed. Study expectations. So when you sign up for a study, there are certain rules that you'll need to follow. One is coming to study visits. So this can mean committing to visits months or even years in the future. It can also mean completing home-based tasks, so taking a medication or completing surveys. And there are a lot of study-specific rules that ask you to do certain things while you're in the study. I'm just going to go through a few examples here, but these are completely study-specific, and your research coordinator would tell you about the rules when you're signing up. So one could be not changing medications during a study without talking to the study team. It could be something like holding medications ahead of a study visit. That could be like if you have PFTs, we might ask you not to take your albuterol for 4 hours ahead of your PFTs. Or if you're having a sputum culture, we might ask you to hold any antibiotics you might be taking for 24 hours ahead of the culture. There could also be things like avoiding using certain products that could interfere with the study medicine. I don't know, something like hair dye. And then also maybe agreeing to take appropriate measures to avoid pregnancy while on a study medication. Again, these are all completely study specific, and it just depends on the rules for each study. So you'll learn about those at the study. Okay. Eligibility. So we need to verify that a participant meets inclusion and exclusion criteria as part of the study. As I mentioned before, every study has different rules and criteria for participation. There can be rules about age and symptoms and specific genetic mutations. Some studies require a confirmed diagnosis for entry. It depends on the study for this. Sometimes it's anyone with a diagnosis. It can be certain genetic mutations. It could be certain ultrastructural defects. There's also sometimes studies have certain lab values for entry, such as FEV1 predicted needs to be within a certain range. Sometimes eligibility can be determined like as part of the consent, or pre-screened like ahead of consenting. But other times we actually have to determine it during the first or sometimes even the second study visit. And I think this is critical to note here. Just because you weren't eligible for a study in the past does not mean you cannot participate in any studies in the future. So every study has different rules on who's allowed to sign up. So just keep that in mind. Just because maybe you weren't eligible for one study a few years ago doesn't mean you wouldn't be eligible for a study that's coming up. Okay, so let's talk study eligibility with a little bit of an example. Okay, so my disclaimer is that this is not a real study. It does have elements that we might see in a PCD study, but this has not been approved by any of the groups we have talked about today. So just keep that in mind. This is not real. So let's talk about that study. So our study title is PCD Foundation Research Readiness Trial. And our objective for the study is to look to see if study medication X increases FEV1% predicted in subjects with PCD. Okay, so what does that mean? So who can do this study? So every study has this eligibility criteria. There's inclusion criteria and there's exclusion criteria. So the inclusion criteria, all of the answers to the various items have to be yes. And then for the exclusion criteria, all of the answers have to be no. Okay, so for this study, someone is going to be between 10 and 50 years old. It's males and females. They have to have a confirmed PCD diagnosis. And in this case, that means having compatible clinical features, and that includes bronchiectasis on a chest CT. And they also have to have a genetic confirmation of PCD. They have to have an FEV1% predicted between 35 to 90% at the screening visit. And then they have to be on a stable medication regimen for 14 days prior to baseline visit. And then exclusion criteria, no history of chest wall surgery, female subjects may not be pregnant or become pregnant during the study, and subjects cannot currently have blue hair. I have seen stranger things in inclusion exclusion criteria. So what do we do from here? We have a schedule of events, okay? So this is like the blueprint for how research teams know what to do for each study. So kind of to hit on the main points of this, this is the different sort of procedures that we're going to be doing over the course of the study. And this is like when they happen. So the different study visits, so screening, baseline, all through. So just to kind of to point out like how after you sign informed consent, which comes first, you need to confirm eligibility. So we have to go back through that little checklist on the last slide to make sure someone is eligible for the study. So some of them, like I said, are sort of easy. We can document, we know what age someone is if they're between 10 and 50, and we can document whether they're male or female for the study. Either was okay. There's other things that we might not be able to know until the screening visit or after. So it said that you had to have a bronchiectasis on chest CT. So, we've got a chest CT here at screening visit. So we're going to need to do that to make sure that someone has bronchiectasis and would be allowed to participate. They also had to have a confirmed genetic diagnosis. So we have to do our genetic panel to make sure that they have confirmed genetics. And then there's also some things that it gives us like little instructions as well on really how to do all of the procedures. So I think one I'll just sort of point out here is on our PFTs at our baseline visit, it has this fun little E right here. So what is E? So E is on day one, so our baseline day one, PFTs have to be done twice. So we have to do our PFTs 60 minutes prior to taking our study medication, and then we have to do it again 30 minutes after taking the study drug administration. So, there's lots of just little kinds of rules and things that we have to follow as we really dig into a study. So I think a fun take home here is study visit days are usually really busy. But anyway, how does the research team know what to do based on this? Well, our coordinators have to do a lot of planning ahead of study visits. So we have to do things like book space in our research center. We have to schedule procedures. So like that chest CT, we've got to book that separately. We have to put in lab orders. We might have to collect medical records from other institutions to make sure we have the whole clinical history. When you're doing a study visit, your coordinator will provide you with a schedule for the day. It'll include the time that you're supposed to arrive, where to meet, where to park, logistical things like that. It'll also include things like key study procedures, and it can even include specific timing of procedures if there's things we really have to be cognizant of. And then, like I said, study procedures sometimes have certain rules, okay? So the example I gave, taking the medicine and then completing the PFTs 30 minutes later. So this could be required because we can assess changes while really limiting variation across the study. So standardizing our work that we're doing. In some instances, this can also be for safety. We want to make sure if we say we need to take PFTs 30 minutes after the medication, that needs to be done. We don't want somebody waiting 90 minutes after they've done their medication. We want to make it standard at 30 minutes in this case. And this is required in studies so researchers can draw conclusions about data without worrying about outside factors complicating the data, like limiting bias. Coordinators must keep these rules in order to maintain the integrity of the data. So a lot of the times, we'll be following these specific things and saying, okay, we have to take the medicine and then we have to do our PFTs 30 minutes later. And it's because we've got to maintain that integrity. And that's our job as research coordinators, to make sure it all goes according to plan. Our study sponsors want the study visits to be the exact same at every visit and at every center. And then the researchers need to have good data to be able to draw conclusions. And then any changes to the schedule of events that we document those on a deviation log. So I think one thing to kind of point out here is we recognize this is a lot. This is a big time commitment for folks. And, we really do appreciate the fact that folks are willing to participate in these studies. And, because of that, we want to make these the best that we can. So we want to make sure we're doing the best job to get the cleanest results that we can possible. So that's that. And then safety, huge thing, okay? So safety is monitored throughout study participation. Certain studies have things like lab work where we're monitoring occurs. And then, you're monitored for new conditions every time you come in and the doctor does a checkup with a physical exam for you. We also check medications and treatment regimens. Also, studies that are considered greater than minimal risk might have a medical monitor who's a doctor, and they usually review certain aspects of the study. There might be requirements for withdrawing subjects if certain safety criteria are met, and those are defined by our study sponsors. And if a safety issue arises, that has to be reported to the medical monitor, IRB, and study sponsor. And there are really specific rules for this. Like sometimes it's a few days, but then there are certain things that are has to be reported within 24 hours. And so the research team has to report it right away. And if we don't, we risk getting our study shut down at our site, or we could risk getting a study shut down at all sites. So, and then studies are also monitored regularly by the sponsor. So they review our data collection forms and our regulatory documents and things like that. So I think here I just want to point out that attention to safety is incredibly important, and it's taken very seriously by the research team. And then, all right, so you got through the study. So what happens then? Finishing a study and follow-up. So during your last study visit, your coordinator is going to collect medication, supplies, anything that was given to you as part of the study. They'll also go through if there's any follow-ups or calls on our schedule of events. Like there was a telephone check-in, and then it was to be 4 weeks after stopping a study medication as a check-in to make sure everything's going okay. These are also described in your informed consent if there are going to be check-ins like this. The other thing that happens is we describe what personal test results you might receive from the study and when study results might be published. And as we all know, publishing study results takes time. And then just a few notes on kind of more logistical things. So travel. So there's a limited number of sites that are doing PCD research, and not every site participates in every single study. So traveling to participating center is often required for study participation. If you need to travel to a study from a distance, you can discuss travel plans with your coordinator. Studies have different rules on travel and lodging. Some studies do have a travel reimbursement component. Often this is limited to the interventional studies, or if we're looking for a really specific group of folks for a study. And then on the flip side, some studies don't have funds for travel. And then details regarding travel and reimbursement is all also described in your informed consent document. And then study reimbursement. So remember, participation in research is always voluntary, and therefore excessive payment for study participation can actually be seen as coercive. Reimbursement depends on the study. It definitely varies based on the time commitment of the study, the types of procedures that are doing and that you're doing, and then of course the funding. Any reimbursement is described in the consent form, and it's reviewed and approved by the IRB before we're allowed to provide reimbursement. And then if there is reimbursement, the coordinator will describe the details. So, you know, it might be a check, they might be giving you a reloadable card. Sometimes there's parking validation, just things like that. And then another just little note here, study labs and procedures are usually paid for by the study. So sometimes folks will get bills for study procedures and that's not supposed to happen. So we kind of always just say, contact your coordinator if something like that happens, and contact your coordinator for anything really. But that is one thing we like to point out. And then if you're interested in learning more about research studies, our current Gdmcc studies are listed on clinicaltrials.gov. We do have some new studies coming soon that we're very excited about. And I'm happy to discuss potential study participation with anyone. And I'm happy to talk about referral processes to other Gdmcc sites, whatever you guys need. And then I just want to share the Gdmcc participating sites. It takes a village to do this work. And I underlined and bolded our research coordinators because they are your tour guides throughout your study participation, and they are mission critical. And then acknowledgements and funding, and I'm ready for questions.
Hi, Kelly. Oh, go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you very much. That was, I think it gives people a real feel for how, first of all, regulated these studies are, how complex they are, and the unbelievable work that study coordinators have to do to get these things off the ground and then successfully completed. You know, I think it's important to note for us as a small patient population, we are the only people who can do research on PCD. No one else can do this for us. So there's a little bit more pressure on us to participate in studies. So understanding what that actually means is really important. And thank you, Kelly, for going through that in such a detailed fashion.
Sure.
We have a question here. What does it mean if you volunteer for a study and never hear back from the coordinator?
Well, I think it depends on the situation. I would say typically it depends how you volunteered. So if a coordinator has emailed you and asked you to participate and then you write back and you don't hear anything, that's one thing. which I think that should not happen. And I think research coordinators should be following up. And I will say folks get busy and things get lost. So if you don't hear back, if you've done something like that, reach out again. Everybody's emails are shared and also phone numbers are shared. So feel free to reach out again, or if it's a Gdmcc study, you can always feel free to reach out to me. If it's something more like clinicaltrials.gov, or you're responding to something like a listserv or something, sometimes those aren't always monitored. So again, I think trying to find a direct contact for a coordinator is really the key. But I think the loop should always be closed, even if maybe you want to sign up for a study and it turns out you're not the right age for it. The loop should be closed that, either we're not looking for participants right now, or it's just not an appropriate study. So, yeah.
Another thing, Kelly, is sometimes the contact information is incorrect on ClinTrials. It hasn't been updated, and they may have prior study coordinators' email address, and so you don't get anything back because it went to the wrong place.
Yeah, unfortunately, our coordinators don't always stay with us for the duration of studies, so that is a problem.
So the Lynn posted the link to clinicaltrials.gov, but I also wanted to just note that there is a separate Gdmcc website that also lists all those trials and may actually be an easier way to find the ongoing open.
I'll post
studies.
that too. One of the questions that we get in the patient group, I think there's confusion between research and their medical record. Like, are they separate? Does one affect the other? Is there anything you can share about that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it is it's sticky in some ways. Now, remember, I cited signing a Hipaa form as part of a research study, and that is required, and it's so the research team can access records. But there are some things that are done only on a research basis, so things that don't make it into the medical record. The Gdmcc, our research genetic testing program, that is actually not related to the medical records, so we keep those records separate. But things that happen while you're coming for a study visit might be part of your record. So like that chest CT I mentioned, that's going to be ordered if you're coming to UNC, that's ordered at UNC. And so that's going to be in your medical record what those results were. Not necessarily what the researchers overread it as, or not the research data that we used from it, but that the scan itself will be in your record. So it does get a little kind of confusing depending on the study. Consent forms do kind of highlight what is in the medical record and if something is not. And the good thing to ask your study coordinators.
Okay, do we have any other questions? I don't think we do. Lots of thank yous and great presentation remarks, Kelly. So thank you very much. In an earlier webinar, we had talked about the need for FDA approval of any interventional drugs that required adequate and well-controlled trials. That's the terminology they use. And I think that Kelly's presentation has given us a glimpse into what that actually means. They're not kidding around. They really need to be well-controlled. So hopefully that helps you just understand a little bit better about why you're being asked to do all these things if you want to participate in research, and it really is to have a successful outcome. I think if we don't have any additional...
This is Mike Knowles.
Yeah.
Could I just make a couple of overview comments? For the people who are on this conference call, Michelle and I got to know each other 20 years ago when she came to UNC because her daughter was having problems, and it turned out it was PCD. And we've been studying PCD for a long time, but before that I was studying cystic fibrosis for 20 years. And what Kelly has said is absolutely true. Participating in research is voluntary. But as you can tell from this talk, thinking about participating can be quite intimidating if you've never had any experience. And so for those of you who feel a little bit intimidated and unsure, I want to encourage you to consider thinking about it and exploring it. And again, you can explore it without ultimately agreeing to participate. But what we find is that most people who decide to do research and become less intimidated by the idea of doing it end up doing it over and over. So the vast bulk of research studies ends up utilizing a relatively small fraction of the patient population. Now, there are many more patients with cystic fibrosis, so that works okay. For primary ciliary dyskinesia, there are fewer subjects. So anyway, I just want to reassure patients that once you're participating, it's not so intimidating, and gathering information, even if you decide not to participate, makes things a little more familiar and a little less intimidating. So I wanted to leave with that note. We have some of the patients who volunteer for doing rare disease research become veterans and participate over and over. And that's beneficence in a different way. That's beneficence giving back to the community and helping other patients with the disease, and even helping patients who will come along later who might benefit from the research. So I wanted to leave with that overview note that I've insight that I've generated over 30 years of doing rare disease research.
To follow up on that, Michelle and Lynn, you may want to have a list of people who've participated in research who are willing to talk to others who are considering it.
That's a great idea. And I 100% endorse that. We have an additional struggle in being a very small group, and there's not a lot of people to do this for us. There's nobody else to do this for us. So we encourage, to the extent possible, considering volunteering and becoming comfortable with the idea of participating in research. Kelli, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and effort to put together that very detailed, helpful presentation.
Thank you so much for having me.